Okay, folks, so this is the next job pod to assist you with your revision for Enquiry Question 2 of the Migration, Identity and Sovereignty Unit. So if we go, first of all, to the pupil learning checklist, which you've also got access to on the learning platform, you should have a hard copy. Here is EQ2 of the Migration, Identity and Sovereignty Unit. How are nation states defined? And how have they evolved in a globalizing world? Again, we go back to that synoptic link. So some great links here to the globalization unit, the diverse places unit, and also the superpowers unit. So I'm not going to delve into these bits here because that's the individual lessons. If we overall look at the subsections of EQ2, so 8b.4, nation states are highly varied. Basically, every country is different and have very different histories. That's the first part. Second part of EQ2 is where we delve into the realms of nationalism. It says there nationalism has played a role in the development of the modern world. So what is it? How does it affect? And then the third part of EQ2 is where it says globalization has led to the deregulation of capital markets. So let's delve into, as a reminder, again, this is to supplement your revision. It's not just a standalone revision resource here that I'm recording. Let's look at the different areas, different lessons, if you like, that we completed. So the first lesson we completed here was on nation states. Now, there's two parts to this. I've got to remind myself of the two different parts. So the first bit, let's go to the actual learning outcome here, was to know that nation states are varied and have different histories. So where did we begin? We started by looking at the ethnic makeup of different countries, and we mentioned some examples here just to show you some countries are more homogeneous in nature, some are more heterogeneous in nature compared to those. So we looked at Iceland, Japan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Singapore, and then the United Kingdom. So that led us into where you researched and produced a comparison, looking at the ethnic variation within these two countries, one being more homogeneous, one being more heterogeneous in nature, Singapore and Iceland. Now, this was the task that I gave you, which you completed. So you can pause and have a look at that now to remind yourselves. But you need to go back to your notes on these two countries because you explored the past demographic growth. How's the country changed in terms of population? A little bit, not too much on the physical geography. How's the politics of the country changed and therefore influence the policies immigration-wise? And then the economic contributions of migrants to both countries. I gave you these resources as a starting point for Iceland. So pause and now to remind yourself if you wish. And I gave you the similar sort of resources for Singapore as a starting point. Okay. So that big comparison is a really important one, which led very nicely into the part 2. It was either on this one or it's on the other PowerPoint. I've got to remember. Yeah. Which was this. Looking at borders. So again, I'm just going to quickly zoom through this to remind yourselves of the different content areas, and do pause it and reread if you wish as part of your revision. So we looked at the natural condition of the earth as actually being borderless. There once upon a time, there were never borders to cross. We looked at what physical constructions and fences are and the role that they play within a border. We looked at this idea of walls around the world. We then discussed the difference between these three different types of border. So we discussed what a domestic border is, what a political border is, and then what an international border is. The sociologist in the room, if I remember rightly, this is where we spoke about the process of othering. do remind yourself of what that is because it's really, really important actually. And then we looked at the process of bordering. How did borders come about? Why did borders come about? When did they come about? Where did they come about? And then we looked at the United Kingdom, how the United Kingdom's internal borders and also external border has changed since 927. Really, there you can see. So remind yourself of that. And this led us in very nicely to what is a natural border and then the colonial history and political intervention, and how colonial history has influenced current borders, and how political intervention from other countries has influenced some borders in some places. We looked at the map of Africa. Whoops, sorry. To show you the current borders, which are the red lines that you can see on there, compared to the previous setup in the African continent, which shows the ethnic homelands and national borders. So there's been a huge change in the African continent, predominantly as a result of colonization and decolonization, and that's had some pretty big impacts in Africa. And then we rounded off here looking at just some examples of borders around the world. France, for example, was a nice physical border with the Alps and the Pyrenees, the USA and Mexico with the River Grande. The UK and France, we've got a bit of water between us. We've got the English Channel. And then some borders, just to give some examples, are due to colonial history and don't take into account different ethnic or religious groups. So in Central Africa, Syria, Iraq, Mali, and West Africa, Egypt and Sudan. And the problem where borders are implemented without considering ethnic and religious groupings, that causes conflict. So I then asked you to go away and have a look at the example here of the Wagar border ceremony, which is the border ceremony that takes place between India and Pakistan. So do remind yourself of what that is, why they do this ceremony, what it represents. And then Rwanda. I asked you to go away and have a look at Rwanda to create yourself a mini case study of how conflict can be caused due to bordering. And I gave you lots of resources to go away and have a look at. There was YouTube links, there was text to go through. So do pause this now if you wish. There's some more information here that you used to help conduct that research. Oh, go back there if you need to pause it. Okay. That led nicely into a lesson on why conflict. So let's go to the learning outcome and why border conflicts have arisen. There's the outcome, the objective to evaluate why border conflict has arisen. Now there's some great synoptic links here again, going back to the superpowers unit. So we looked at what can cause territorial disputes and border disputes, often related to the possession of natural resources. So there's conflict over resources that can cause a border dispute. Fertile land. If you're particularly poor countries, you need fertile land. Water as another resource. Disputes over culture, religion, ethnic nationalism, and also linked to colonial history. Ethnic clusters in the bordering country. So all of these are not necessarily standalone, some of them could be, are causes of territorial disputes and border disputes. So we then set the scene for Taiwan and China, where we discuss what is the setup here between Taiwan. Is it an independent country? Is it not? What does China say about Taiwan? What does the USA say about Taiwan? And why is there this dispute, this conflict over the country, the island of Taiwan. So just remind yourself again of that example. I went through with you in a little bit of detail, Taiwan not being recognized as an independent country by some countries such as China. And I gave you a bit of history here. So again, you can pause this and have a look about why China has this dispute over Taiwan. Where did it start? Where did it come from? Again, we explored Taiwan in a bit more depth. And you explained here why is the country's status under threat from China and how could this lead to future global conflict. There's a really good BBC website to look at. And then another example of contested border for a slightly different reason is the Ukraine-Russia example. Now, a lot of the information that presented here was information based on the situation before the current war between Ukraine and Russia. It was more focused upon the Crimea annexation. So I gave you lots of resources to analyze and we discussed what was going on, why has this happened. We discussed this text, you took this away and you wrote some notes up on this about what did Russia do, why did it do it, what were the impacts of this. Screen's not moving. And then was part 2 of why conflict. And this is where I asked you to look at the Kashmir example. Again, it's another disputed area where you've got a border between Pakistan and India, and you've got this disputed region of Kashmir. Why is it contested? What is the impact of this? So do go back to those links, your own notes to remind yourself of that. And that gave you 3 good examples of border conflicts, border disputes, or disputed territories, if you like. Right, so that led into the lesson on, oh, have I done the right one there? Nope, sorry, bear with me. A lesson on nationalism. Come on. It's taking its time to load for some reason. That's not the one we want. Okay. So the outcome, the objective is to describe how nationalism influenced colonialism. So a bit of history here. We looked at this mini starter, looking at these definitions. What was empire? What was colonialism? What was the scramble for Africa? And so on. 2 key concepts, causality and identity we looked at. And we watched a YouTube clip here, which led nicely into the starter, which was Rudyard Kipling's The White Man's Burden. I asked you to read that, and then we discussed it. What symbolism is reflected in his poem? What was it telling you? What was it saying about what was going on? So remind yourself of that. We then liken this to the Game of Thrones. Don't need to dwell on that too much for your revision. And this is where we start to talk about where history and geography converge. The idea of a nation state and nationality is actually quite a new thing. In terms of political history and time, or we go back to geological time, it's very, very new. So we explored this. We linked it to the Game of Thrones, as I said. We looked at traditions and laws and how they varied. So again, remind yourself of the general background to a nation state and nationality in terms of nationalism. So we then looked at the emergence of Europe's nation states because it was one of the first areas of the globe to implement borders and create nation states. So have a read, part of your revision, go back to your notes on this. And then we delved into this idea of nationalism in a bit more depth. So do make sure you're clear that you understand what nationalism is, how it influences the creation of a country, why does it influence the nation of a country. And then we looked at some examples that we only stated them when nationalism was established via the French Revolution, where it removed the absolute power of the French monarchy, placing power into the hands of ordinary people. So it's a really good example of nationalism and how it created a country. And then we explored how nationalism, why many people are threatened by nationalism, because nationalism can go to an extreme. So we link this back to the French nationalism again. Some people saw it as a threat. Um, have a read of this again to remind yourself of that example. And we then linked this into the consequences of empire, because empire was a form of nationalism. Well, one country is trying to impose its beliefs, its way of doing things upon another. And this had big consequences around the world. Imperialism, colonialism. Why did it happen? Where did it happen? When did it happen? And the consequences of that. Now, I made sure you understood the difference between imperialism and colonialism, because it's really important. And then we looked again at the British Empire. Pause this here if you wish. What was it? What did it do? Why did it do it? Where did it do it? Just some examples. And there was a bit more. And we looked at a bit more on the British Empire. So these two maps show you the changes in countries in Europe. If you remember this lesson, 1850 there, you can see very different to today. The big thing that jumps out there, or the two big things, is the Russian Empire and the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and also the Ottoman Empire. Actually, you've got three big empires within Europe. If you were to split the current map of Europe in half, predominantly the eastern part of that was Russian, Austro-Hungarian, or the Ottoman Empire. Whereas in 1920, totally changed. And that's where we discussed that borders, boundaries shifted. This created tensions, and you had a task here to complete, which actually I don't think we did this year because you didn't need to do it. Right, that led us into lesson 11. Now I think this might be where we have a bit of repeat, so I might have combined them into one. Let me just remind myself. No, it wasn't. Okay. So this was looking at the end of colonial rule. So once empire had started to break down, new nation states started to appear. So the objective was to understand how the end of colonial rule in areas like Africa led to the establishment of new nation states and how they affected other parts of the globe. So this was where we start with this image of a person voting in Namibia in 1989 as a result of independence. People actually getting a vote. Really important because it does appear very clearly in the spec about this British Prime Minister, Harold Macmillan, his Winds of Change speech you listened to. And do go onto YouTube and listen to that again as a reminder. What did he say? Why did he say it? What he said was one of the most important speeches in terms of African independence. Do remind yourself of that. We link this into anti-apartheid again in Johannesburg, South Africa. We looked at what's happening there in South Africa, what was going on. Whoops, if you need to pause. And then we spoke in quite some depth about this scramble for Africa. Very brief history where we looked at a clip. Again, watch that clip again as part of your revision. Remind yourself of what this scramble for Africa was. Because it's a really important element of history in the creation of nation states. Not necessarily a good thing, as you will see. And here was two maps that we looked at, very simple maps. On the left-hand side was colonial Africa, to show you in just terms of colours, the different parts of the African continent that, for example, was a British colony. They call it English colony, but a British colony. Which parts were Italian and French, Portuguese, and so on. Compared to after decolonisation and independence, that is the African map that we have today, the creation of these new nation states in post-colonial Africa. There's a couple of articles to read to understand this, the perspectives on the African continent as well. A couple more maps there. We looked at African independence. So we picked a couple of examples there. For example, Zambia achieved independence in 1964. 1 minute before my Google Meet tries to kick me out, which we, of course, do not want. Sorry, folks. Well, it's annoying when that keeps appearing. Just give it a second, it will disappear. There we go. And then that led into the case study creation, where we looked at Rwanda and the Rwandan genocide. So here's the key bits that you looked at. What happened in Rwanda? Why did the genocide take place? So do make sure you've got that as a clear case study. There was an optional homework there to research some more conflicts for one of these, the South Sudan conflict, or what went on in Vietnam, or what went on with the Democratic Republic of Congo. Okay, let's progress on to the next part of EQ2, which is called historical ties. So the objective here was to understand how historical ties have influenced migration and ethnic makeup of particular countries. We started off at the top there, exploring the two terms of what is heterogeneity and homogeneity. And then we made that clear. Okay, so we discussed here a map. Compare this map of world languages with a map of 19th century European empires. Now, there's one here, we've got both of them on the screen. So, map on the left shows world languages. The map on the right shows the different empires, if you like. So, if we pick the pinky areas there, that's for the areas of British Empire. And we compare that to particular languages today, there is a bit of a correlation there. For example, South America is a good one. Apart from Brazil and also Guyana, majority of South America are Spanish speakers, because the majority of those countries were colonized by the Spanish. So the Spanish language is imposed upon South America. We then explored some data on a graph, looking at the number of migrants, total foreign population, and we summarized here with some clear notes. Remind yourselves of those if you need to pause. We looked at the top 10 countries of birth of migrants in London. And what we did here is we delved into why are these countries so high? India, why was that the most? It's a former colony. So we looked at previous colonies and how those previous colonies have impacted upon the ethnic makeup of our country. Poland, for example, why high? Lots of Polish migrants came to the UK from 2004 onwards because of the expansion of the European Union, the accession of the Eastern European countries into the European Union. Pakistan, Nigeria, former colonies of the UK. Countries such as France, we have a fair number of French people living here because it's geographically close. So we'd explore the different factors that led to the ethnic makeup of particular diaspora communities in the UK and why they're high. We then looked at some more data. How has migration from British colonies affected the UK? Whoops, sorry, too fast. Just remind yourself if you want to pause of the data that we discussed in lesson. And then we looked at the reverse. We looked at, okay, migration from UK to India. You would have explored what the push and pull factors were, encouraging UK citizens to move back to India. So this is about either first generation or second generation migrants in the UK of Indian origin that have come here, lived and worked here, got British citizenship, had children, either they and or their children, now going back to India. What's the push? What's the pull? What's the good? What's the negatives of that movement? And one of the big elements of that was the Indian government's Overseas Citizenship of India programme. What is it? What are the benefits of it? And what were the advantages of that programme for the Indian government? So that led us on to, it always seems a bit of an add-on, this one. A lesson here on tax havens. All part of, it's the last bit, if you like, of EQ2. So we had a discussion about these companies. What do these companies all have in common? And then some information on these four people. What do they have in common? And it was all linked to tax. What were these four different locations? What do they have in common? And then some information on each of these three. Nice little examples if you need to use them. So do pause to remind. And then I did emphasize this, that Facebook, this is that £4,327 they paid in tax in 2014 was less tax than I paid in that year as I was a working person in the UK. We looked at these four individuals. Again, you could quote them in an exam. And these four locations, prime examples of areas of the world that could be considered as tax havens. So, the outcome objective of this lesson was to understand and argue a case for or against. So you were evaluating here in this lesson, is a tax haven, what's good about them, what's not good about them, who would support them, who would not support them. So we're starting off here, bit of background info. What are tax havens? And then we looked at some data, different countries, different tax rules, how much money. Pause after each of these if you want to relook. And we looked at the top tax havens in the world. Barbados, if you look at the top three, Barbados, Luxembourg, Cayman Islands. Really small countries. Excuse me. We looked at global wealth. And in particular, the missing tax revenues, $185 billion of money that could be used in tax to improve countries' situations goes to tax havens. Again, we looked at some top tax havens and some data. And then we really delved into the ins and outs of what is a tax haven, how do they work, where have they come from. So remind yourselves of that. We've sort of done this already, describe the global distribution of tax havens. So basically give some examples of some. and a bit more on some examples. Pause here if you want to reread. And then we looked at what actually the primary uses of tax havens. Why do they actually exist? So there's 4 main reasons there. Make sure you review those. We looked at the idea of trade liberalisation, the idea of deregulation as well, which are both part of the tax haven issue that we've got. We looked here at some of the new rules, and this is where we went back a little bit actually to the creation of new states. Link this back to that thing called the Washington Consensus, deregulation, privatization. All of that combined has led to the development of tax havens. And then we explored what's actually wrong with this. What's the problem of avoiding tax? So remind yourself here. And then link this into some of the developing countries in the world, the poorest countries in the world, some of the impacts on them. We looked at this idea of never say the word, kleptocracies. What are they? And then we evaluated, brought all of it together. What are the arguments for? What are the arguments against? So we looked at different players, how government ministers in offshore tax havens, expats living in tax havens, the CEO of a TNC. We looked at what would they say about these. Some would be in favour, some would be against. The attitudes of these different stakeholders with regards to tax havens. And here were the resources. No, the resources aren't there. So, and the final lesson, actually there's 2 bits to the, I think I broke this into 2 this year, of EQ2 is focusing down on global inequality. Excuse me. Okay, so the objective here is to understand how globalization led to the deregulation of capital markets and the emergence of new states. This is where we looked at this seesaw, 8 billionaires on one side compared to 3.6 billion of the poorest people on the other. We explored what were your thoughts on this. Why does this inequality exist? Why do very few people with that much money have so much compared to 3.6 billion of the poorest people in the world? So we looked at what the issue is. Why is this a threat? We looked at global inequalities overall. And then we looked at how do we measure inequality. And this is where we delved into this thing called the Gini coefficient or the Lorenz curve. Now, I gave you a nice simple summary of this in the lesson, so do go back to your notes about what is the Lorenz curve, what is the Gini coefficient. You don't need to know the complicated maths that lie behind this. It's what the data, the figure, for example, here, if you like, the most evenly distributed countries in terms of equality, the more equal countries where you don't have such a big gap between the rich and the poor are Sweden, Denmark, Slovenia, Iceland, and Slovakia. You can see the Gini coefficient numbers are lower. So the lower the Gini coefficient number, the more equal or the less unequal the country is. Compared to a higher figure, you can see there, the more unequal, you've got Namibia, South Africa, Lesotho, Botswana, Central African Republic. And you can see the difference in the size of that Lorenz curve. The smaller the Gini coefficient, the smaller the Lorenz curve, and vice versa. And what we explored here was some different shapes of those. We don't need to dwell on that too much now. You've got that in your notes. And then we looked at the UK's Gini coefficient. How has that changed since 2002 up to 2014? We looked here at India, very little movement at all. We looked at Brazil, so the figure's going down. So it's actually slowly becoming more equal. China's right at the top there, so China is more unequal. And this is where I think I went a bit overboard. And when we did some practice, we looked at some examples, and I put 2 questions to you to make sure you understood about the area of A, the size of the Lorenz curve. Does that mean a country is more equal, less equal, and vice versa? So, hang on a moment. Let's make sure. Yes, the elephant in the room. I gave you an article to read and take away and make some notes on called The Elephant in the Room. It's a good BBC News article as well, linked to global inequality. Basically, it's a graph that was produced showing the percentile of global income distribution. It's sort of the shape of an elephant with a trunk at the end. So you explored this, who are the winners, who are the losers. So do go back to your notes on what this was telling you. Okay. That then is actually, let me just double check here, folks. So I had a part 2 here. I think this way I may have put it all together. Yes. So this was a webinar discussion looking at inequality. If you want to re-watch this, you can look at this on the Sixth Form Learning platform. It is in that folder. So that rounds off Enquiry Question 2 of the Migration, Identity and Sovereignty unit. So if we just recap, nation states are highly varied and have very different histories. Second part was all about nationalism, the role it's played, and a role in the development of the modern world. And finally was globalization led to the deregulation of capital markets and the development of tax havens. So that rounds off EQ2. Thank you very much, everybody.